This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Sudan's military council and alliance of opposition groups sign political accord. UNICEF warns of higher Ebola risk to very young children. And South Sudan's President Salva Kiir set to meet opposition leader Riek Machar. Hello and welcome to CGTN. This is Africa Live and I'm Karen Roberts in Nairobi. Also coming up in the programme. In business, Zambia's newly appointed finance minister calls for more austerity measures. And in sport, Nigeria and Tunisia gearing up to face off in the third place playoff of the Africa Cup of Nations. We begin in Sudan, where the ruling military council and alliance opposition groups have agreed to a political accord. The accord is part of a power-sharing deal aimed at leading the African nation to democracy. It was signed in Khartoum in the presence of African mediators following a night of marathon talks to iron out some details of the agreement reached earlier this month. The two sides are still working on a constitutional declaration, which is expected to be signed on Friday. They've been wrangling for weeks over who would lead the country to democratic elections, leading to weeks of protests. This follows the ousting of President Omar al-Bashir's 30-year rule by the military on the 11th of April. Well, we are now joined by CGTN's Adel El-Mahrouhi, who is in Cairo for us, and in the studio, Michael Arunga, South Sudan and Sudan analyst based in Nairobi. Thank you for joining us. First to you, Adel, what has Sudan's military council and opposition coalition agreed upon precisely?
Well, they have agreed on a series of principles in general and a way of power sharing throughout the coming more than 3 years, after which a civilian government will be elected. The main differences were about a supreme council, which will be composed of 5 members of the military council, 5 members from the civilian opposition leaders. The head of that Supreme Council, or Sovereign Council, will be led by the military for the coming 21 months, followed by 18 months of leadership by the civilian powers, which means that in terms of current authority, the military will stay in power within the next 21 months, but they will be joined by 5 members who will not have the majority in the saying of any decisions in that council itself. They've encouraged to do immediate reform in the government and the military. The reform in the military will be led by the military council as stated by the law, and in terms of the government reform, economic reform will be led by the civilian powers. They will form a government. The members of that government will be recommended by the civilian opposition powers. They are the ones who will be recommending the names for the members that will be leading the Sudanese cabinet in the coming period. They will be looking into improving Sudan's international relations, especially with its neighboring countries. There has been some tension between Khartoum and other neighboring countries, including Egypt, in the past years, so they want to get that over with. There will be the cabinet will be composed of 20 members, and after 3 months or within 3 months, they will be forming a legislative body in Sudan to take the lead into all the needed legislation through the transitional period until they reach elections after about roughly it's about nearly 40 months from now.
Okay, and I will return to you in a moment. Thank you. Over to you, Michael Arunga. Looks like a delicate balancing act. What would you say this agreement means, and how have these two parties agreed on the issues that delayed the signing in the first place?
This is extremely exciting for me. I spent 2 years in Darfur the height of the confusion. They have seen firsthand, the atrocities committed. I've been able to visit Otash camp, Kalma camp, and Al Salam within Darfur. Been able to interview hundreds of displaced people within Darfur. So I can feel the excitement about this agreement in relation to it returning the country to normalcy. We expect the parties to be able to delve into the issues of good governance in terms of better structures of governance, in terms of being able to take care of the people that live within the country that have been violated. I expect for humanitarian organizations better access in terms of being able to reach out with relief rations to those who are affected, who are still in the camps with different parts of that country. I expect better governance. Sudan is the only other country where you need an entry visa and an exit visa, things like that to be addressed so that normalcy can return to the country.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We will now return to you, Adel. Adel, so quite a few issues there and good governance and so forth that needs to be done. What has the reaction been in Sudan? Is everyone happy with the accord, would you say?
Well, despite that, the opposition powers have not been granted their demand of immediate handing over the power to a civilian government or a civilian leadership. Still, the notions or the calls against the military council has been calm for now. It is still not clear how will this proceed. The military council is still ruling for the coming 21 months, which means that there is tension expected to grow unless the military council abides to the agreed upon agreement and shows actual progress toward moving toward the civilian government. However, in terms of actual change, nothing that they have been wanting has been achieved so far, but at least there is a promise that transition will come over. What has been quite key for them is that to know that before the elections, the opposition leaders will be leading the country in a civilian form before the final transitional period gets over. There's also an agreement that none of the members from the military side or the civilian side who will be leading the country during this transitional period, none of them will be allowed to run in any form of elections onwards, which has been one of the comforting sides to the protesters. At least they know that specific military generals who have been playing an integral role in the government and in the country in that period will not be part of the future political life.
Okay, thank you very much, Adele. Over to you again, Michael. What do you expect to see after this agreement?
What Adele is describing, I think, is a good step in terms of them coming together. So I expect, based on what has happened to Omar al-Bashir, for people there to be a bit of semblance of, appreciation of the aspects of good governance and then
accountability.
Yes, exactly. So to ensure that they don't face the challenges that have been there in the past in terms of that tension and conflict that has happened in the past. 2008, when I was there, there was an attempted coup. Actually, rebels attempted to enter into Khartoum, and they were repulsed. So right now, against that euphoria of people taking it upon themselves, I expect them to take the people seriously, which has not happened in the past. I expect Darfur, which has had a lot of problems, for those who are in the camps to go back to their homes and to be able to ensure that there is a better access for humanitarian organizations, normalcy, which has not been visited upon Sudan for a very long time.
Okay, thank you very much for your analysis. That was Michael Arunga there, South Sudan and Sudan analyst based in Nairobi. And earlier, of course, we were talking to CGTN's Adel El-Mahrouki in Cairo. Moving on to other news now. The World Health Organization has confirmed that an emergency meeting on the DRC Ebola outbreak will take place on Wednesday afternoon in Geneva. UN health experts and partners are to decide whether the situation warrants declaring an international emergency. This follows the first confirmed case in the DRC city of Goma. Ahead of that meeting, the UN Children's Fund, UNICEF, has warned that the epidemic is infecting more children than in earlier outbreaks.
This outbreak is affecting more children than previous outbreaks of Ebola. As of the 7th of July, there had been 750 infections among children. This represents 31% of total cases, compared with about 20% in previous outbreaks.
Well, CGTN's Chris Ocharinga joins us from Kinshasa for more on the story. Chris, the WHO meeting is expected today. What is the government's take on that?
Well, the government has been against this declaration right from the outset because they're saying it will have a negative consequence on their economy. This public health emergency of international concern is a well-intentioned declaration that's supposed to mobilize resources and, galvanize support from world leaders to help end this outbreak. But the negative impact is that countries may impose trade and travel restrictions on the DRC. And now, the Goma, where the latest case was reported recently, is the capital of North Kivu province. And it's a very important commercial hub. That is the place where most of the areas, the eastern DRC relies heavily on goods from Uganda and Rwanda. And so if the Rwanda decides to issue a travel advisory, then it could have a very devastating impact on the economy. What has already happened is that the Rwandan government has issued a travel alert to its citizens, asking them against making unnecessary travel to the DRC and accommodating people. They haven't closed the border because they're saying it's not necessary, but they have stepped up the surveillance. But then who knows if the World Health Organization decides to declare it a public health emergency of international concern, that raises the risk of the disease spreading regionally and globally, and countries may exercise their sovereignty and decide to close the borders to people from the DRC, and that will really affect the country and bring another problem. So DRC authorities are against that from that perspective, but it's beyond them. The World Health Organization has the mandate of declaring epidemics that have a very high risk of spreading across the region and globally. And so it's really going to be their call. We're waiting for that decision later today.
Okay, so we're still awaiting that decision. The borders are still open. What is the latest on the vaccination program in Goma and the rest of the DRC?
Yes, the authorities here have said that they have already identified 37 high-risk cases. These are patients who traveled with the pastor who came from Butembo, who contracted Ebola, and they have already vaccinated them. They've also got 40 other cases. These are people who came into contact with the 37 high-risk, and they have also vaccinated some of them. Altogether, they have identified 97 people. And they say the vaccination has started and it's going to go on until they get all of them. There was an incident recently that scared people in Goma. 2 relatives of the pastor who was infected with Ebola went missing, and people in Goma were very worried that it would spread the disease in their area. But they have been found and they're going to be vaccinated, and so right now situation has kind of calmed down. People have been told what to do to avoid getting Ebola, and that is really the situation. Overall, there are more than 100,000 people who have been vaccinated in North Kivu and Ituri province, and it's going on amid challenges of security, especially in North Kivu. But the authorities here have said they're going to do all they can to ensure that they bring this outbreak to an end.
Okay, thank you very much for that update. That was CG10's Chris Ocharinga there in Kinshasa for us. Well, as Chris was saying, the World Health Organization is scheduled to meet to decide whether the Ebola outbreak in the DR Congo constitutes an international health emergency. Only 4 emergencies have been declared in the past decade. So what factors are taken into consideration before a public health emergency is declared? CG10's Robert Nagila has more.
It's almost 1 year since the Ebola outbreak was declared in the eastern DRC. More than 1,650 people have died in the current outbreak, with about 12 new cases reported every day. On Sunday, the first case of Ebola was confirmed in Goma in eastern DR Congo, a city of about 2 million people, while neighboring Uganda has also registered cases of the virus. So what is taken into consideration before an international emergency is declared? First, an independent panel of medical experts who sit on the World Health Organization Emergency Committee meet to evaluate the latest evidence and if it constitutes a public health emergency of international concern. Their assessment traces early origins and the subsequent evolution of the epidemic, where we currently stand, and current outbreaks. This include epidemiological projections of how the epidemic is likely to evolve. This information is provided from a risk assessment conducted by the WHO to identify preparedness of neighboring countries. If an international health emergency is declared, public health measures such as funding and resources are boosted. Recommendations on trade and travel are also issued. The panel, which twice before decided not to declare an emergency, has only declared 4 emergencies in the past decade. They include the H1 virus that caused an influenza pandemic in 2009, West Africa's Ebola outbreak, polio in 2014, and the Zika virus in 2016. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Meanwhile, Uganda has scaled up communication strategies to increase awareness of Ebola among Congolese refugees arriving in the country. CGTN's Daniel Arapmoy is at Kagoma Reception Centre, a point of entry for fleeing Congolese refugees into Uganda.
As the first case of Ebola is confirmed in Goma, the Democratic Republic of Congo's most populated city to see Ebola yet, the Uganda government and relief agencies are on the ground, working in refugee reception centers in Changwali and health facilities to sensitize refugees on how to recognize Ebola symptoms and safely triage and transfer suspected cases to Ebola treatment centers.
If you don't know, you find somebody just dead instantly and you don't know what the person died of, it's not good for you to bury that person yourself. Go to the health facility. They will help you out, come with somebody trained to bury the person, and they will bury the person instead of you contracting the disease from there.
Uganda is currently mobilizing the new arrivals from Congo's restive Ituri province using communication strategies that include interpersonal communication, community engagement and capacity building in order to contain the deadly Ebola virus. With the current threats of Ebola, officials are trying to sensitize the refugees, especially those coming in from the Democratic Republic of Congo, on how Ebola is spread and how it can be prevented. Trained health teams are currently mandated to conduct a range of activities to provoke engagement among the refugees regarding Ebola preparedness, prevention and control.
There are digital thermometers which read their temperatures. So we screen for Ebola for the new arrivals, and we monitor them for 21 days. So that's how we do our screening for Ebola.
Though the spread of the disease to Goma is a sign that the response still has work to do in gaining the trust of the local population, Uganda has made progress to reset and reevaluate the response strategy to effectively deal with the Ebola threat. Daniel Arapmoy, CGTN, Changwali Reception Center, Hoima District, Uganda.
To other news now. South Sudanese are looking forward to a possible meeting between President Salva Kiir and opposition leader Riek Machar. The African Union says a regular meeting between the two former rival leaders is needed to help push the peace process forward. CGTN's Patrick Oyet now reports.
The African Union and the East African Regional Body IGAD say there should be a meeting between President Salva Kiir and designated Vice President Riek Machar at the end of this month. One South Sudanese political analyst says the meeting would be the right thing to do.
I think the meeting between President Salva Kiir Mayardit and Dr. Riek Machar, the leader of SPLM IO, is very important because it will build trust between the two parties.
Security sector reforms remain the biggest challenge to the formation of a unity government. President Salva Kiir's government says it doesn't have the necessary funding to carry out reforms. It is urging international donors to help, but many in the international community say they would like to see tangible progress on the implementation of the peace deal, including transparency in the use of the country's finances before they can contribute. Another challenge to the peace process is the groups opposed to the current peace arrangement. One such armed group is headed by South Sudan's former deputy military chief, Thomas Cirillo.
It's like this peace doesn't help anything because there are some maybe guys like Thomas Cirillo, they are not there in the peace deal. So we believe if they go for a meeting, they do anything, nothing will happen, nothing will come to maybe into consideration. That people will believe that this peace deal is the actual peace. Unless they bring these guys like the Thomas Cirillo, they bring them into this peace deal, then maybe things will work out.
We are tired of war. We need peace so that we can move the whole night doing our business. Then we will say there is peace. I hope that at the end of this month, when President Salva Kiir meets Riek Machar, everything will be fine.
It is now 3 months to the scheduled formation of a unity government.
The government of national unity will be formed in November. You don't need to implement all the provisions of the agreement to form the government.
The African Union says the meeting would also help the former rivals to begin to work out details of the would-be unity government, but it is still unclear where or whether the meeting will be held. Patrick Oyet, CGTN, Juba, South Sudan.
We're going to a short break now. Lots more coming up, including Turkish sailors seized by pirates off Nigerian coast, and US Congress to hear from victims' family members on Ethiopian airline crash.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Ten Turkish sailors were taken hostage by armed pirates off the coast of Nigeria on Tuesday. Shipping company Kadioklu Denizcilik said 8 other sailors were also aboard the ship. Kadioklu said its Turkish-flagged Paksoy 1 cargo ship was attacked in the Gulf of Guinea as it sailed from Cameroon to Ivory Coast without freight. In a statement, the company said, according to initial information, there were no injuries or casualties reported. The spokesman for Turkey's ruling AK party said the government was closely following the matter and called for the sailors to be returned safely. He declined to give further details. Last week, the International Maritime Bureau described the Gulf of Guinea as the most dangerous area in the world for piracy. It said 73% of all sea kidnappings and 92% of hostage takings took place in the Gulf of Guinea.
We are monitoring this incident. Turkish Foreign Ministry and the intelligence agency are working on this matter intensely. I will not give you detailed information about the ongoing operation for the sake of our actions. However, you should know that we are following the incident from the start with sensitivity, and all of our units are focused on this matter. We are also monitoring the developments from here within our capabilities.
We're joined now by CGTN's Phil Ihaza in Abuja in Nigeria for us, and also Michal Bar-David in Antalya in Turkey. Over to you first, Phil. What is the latest on the kidnapping you have?
Well, thank you, Karen. So far, what we know is that 10 crew members of a ship, a Turkish ship, off the coast of Nigeria, the Gulf of Guinea, were kidnapped by heavily armed pirates, 12 actually in number, and actually there were 18 crew members, and out of the 18, 10 were kidnapped Turkish nationals, and 8 others were let to go. We also know that the ship currently has berthed in Ghana. They are also in talks with the pirates, and the Turkish ministry is in talks to see how that they can secure the release of of these kidnapped or abducted sailors. So far, we don't know whether the pirates have requested for ransom or not, but we know that that the Gulf of Guinea borders Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, Ghana, Togo, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and a host of other countries. The Gulf of Guinea is also seen as rated as the most dangerous sea in the Atlantic Ocean in the world, actually, by the International Maritime Bureau. It is also one of the most lucrative trade routes by sea across the continent. We hope that subsequently will see their release. But if you look back in 2018 September, a Swiss ship was also attacked, and out of 19 crew members, 12 were kidnapped by pirates. So that area is also known for rampant kidnaps like this that we've seen.
Okay, thanks, Phil. We will return to you. Michelle, as Phil was saying, there were 18 crew members, 8 were kidnapped. What's the latest on the crew members?
Well, just to correct you a little bit there, 8 had remained on the ship and 10 were kidnapped. We know that the 8 who had remained on the ship are safe. They have now reached Ghana with their ship. Luckily, they were not harmed during the incident when the pirates had boarded the ship. So we know they are safe. They had not been injured. Regarding the 10 who were kidnapped by the pirates, we do not know if they are injured, if they are still alive. However, there is talks going on between Turkish officials. Hopefully, they're trying to communicate with the pirates. They're trying to make sure that these 10 kidnapped Turkish sailors return home safely. Of course, we're still waiting for confirmation of the ransom request. It's not clear whether it has been made, but Turkish officials are waiting for this ransom request to be made. But of course, for that to happen, for the pirates to actually receive a ransom, they need the 10 kidnapped people to be alive, to be safe, and to return safe. But we are hoping that right now that they will remain safe and that they will return back home to Turkey without being injured.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Over to you, Phil, in Abuja. There's been an upsurge in kidnappings in Nigeria. What is the government doing to help improve the situation there?
Well, the government is doing, the government is doing a number of things to ensure that kidnappings in the country is curtailed. In April, the security officials launched an operation, a military or rather joint task operation called Operation Puff Adder to reduce the level of kidnappings in the country. Was also extended indefinitely to see how that the kidnappings, especially in the northwestern and central parts of the country, is reduced. Actually, just earlier this week, 13 suspects were paraded in the nation's capital, Abuja. Those were involved in a high-profile kidnap case that occurred in May, where a relative of the President Muhammadu Buhari, who is head of a district, Daura district in Katsina State, was kidnapped and released 2 months after. Now, the suspects were paraded and investigations are going on, as well as some other suspects that have been arraigned as a result of the Operation Puff Adder, which is still ongoing. Several past leaders have called for concerns and worries on how that the government needs to look more seriously into it, because the kidnap case was something that occurred more rampantly in like 15 years ago in the Niger Delta region, that's the southern part of the country, with oil militants kidnapping expatriates for ransom. But we've seen over the years that it has mushroomed to several parts of the country, especially in the northwestern and central region, like Zamfara State, Kaduna State, Katsina State, and the rest of them. So now what we're seeing is whether young, old, rich or poor, people are kidnapped and their families are contacted for ransom, demand of ransom by these kidnappers, and in most cases they are killed when they're not able to pay. So we're just hoping that the government will look more seriously into this and the case of kidnap is brought to a barest minimum.
Okay, thank you, Phil. And finally, back to you, Michelle. What more do we know about how the incident took place and indeed the pirates?
Well, according to the testimonials from the crew members who did remain on the ship, from the 8 crew members that remained, The pirates seemed very professional. They knew exactly what to do. They approached the ship with military-style speedboats. They then intercepted the radio signals of the ship just as the crew was trying to send an emergency signal. They then boarded the ship. They shot at the communications equipment. They destroyed the communications equipment so the crew could not send any further signals. That's when they threatened the crew that they would burn down the ship if they did not surrender to the pirates. So the crew felt they had to do so. That's when the pirates took 10 of the crew members, including the captain, on their speedboats, and they kidnapped them, and the 8 others remained on the ship. That's how it played out, and this is according to the testimonials of the crew members who remained on the ship.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. That was first of all, CGTN's Philahasa in Abuja in Nigeria, and Michelle Bar-David in Antalya in Turkey on the kidnapping of the 10 Turkish sailors off the coast of Nigeria. Moving on to other news now, activists and opposition politicians in Ethiopia have declared the southern region of Sidama as a separate federal state within the country, aggravating regional tensions within Ethiopia. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has said that there would be military action if it goes ahead. The electoral board of the country now says it needs time before it gives a constitutionally backed answer to the request. CGTN's Giram Chala has more.
There are at least 11 requests within the southern Ethiopia regional state which demand to form a separate state in the Ethiopian Federation. And of those, Sidama and Walaita have already hoisted flags which represent their future regional governments. The Ethiopian government is unhappy with that move and said until answers are given based on the constitution itself, all that is being done is illegal. In fact, the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed himself said unlawful moves will militarily be dealt with. Ethiopia's electoral board on its part in a statement has asked people to be patient as the board needs reforms before a referendum on the same can take place. The board specifically said it has received the request of Sidama about 7 months back and is being prepared to stage the referendum within the coming 5 months' time. It looks like there is a lot of work that needs to be done before the questions of additional membership in the Ethiopian Federation can get legal answers. Grumtara CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Now to the ongoing situation with Boeing following the crash of the 737 MAX 6 minutes after takeoff in Ethiopia and 5 months after the same model crashed in Indonesia. Well, preliminary reports in both cases highlighted the role of an automated system that erroneously pointed the plane's nose down as pilots struggled to override it. Well, the 2 crashes killed 346 people. Victims' families have now filed a lawsuit accusing Boeing of negligence.
Before flying to Washington to testify to a crowd of aviation experts and lawmakers this week, Paul Njoroge spent a desolate weekend packing away toys his children would never play with again. 3 of his relatives were killed alongside his wife Caroline and mother-in-law Anne on Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 on March 10th.
My family was my life. That was my life taken away from me within 6 minutes. So I know that, ever since it happened, I have thought of those 6 minutes every day of my life. And, I don't know if that will ever stop. I'll think about those 6 minutes every day of my life. So my life will never be normal again.
Paul Njoroge has not been able to work since the crash, which occurred during his family's visit to their native Kenya. Getting justice is his only motivation now.
Every time when I'm walking along the streets and I see people with their children playing and having some joyful moments, I miss my children a lot. And I miss my wife a lot when I see a couple walking together, holding hands.
Njoroge will testify in Congress during Wednesday's hearing, along with the acting director of the National Transportation Safety Aviation Board and the officials from aviation workers' unions. In addition to Congress's probe into the Boeing airline, Njoroge wants the certification process of the U.S. government's Federal Aviation Administration, which deemed the plane safe to fly, to be scrutinized.
So it's up to them to make sure that the FAA is fully funded and that it's functional enough and that it's doing, that the authority is doing what they're supposed to be doing, and that is to be an oversight, to make sure that Boeing is doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Boeing's 737 MAX was grounded worldwide after the Ethiopian crash in March. Before the model is approved to fly again, Njoroge and other families of victims want the recertification of the entire plane, whose original design dates back to the 1960s. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
We've got all the business news coming up for you after the break, including Zambia's newly appointed finance minister calls for more austerity measures. And the Central Bank of Kenya warns banks and tech firms that they could be liable for cybersecurity breaches.
Africa, the most iconic wildlife destination in the world. Its unique ecosystems were formed over countless eons. Many people can only dream of visiting this natural paradise. But now, for the first time ever, CGTN Wild Wonderland live show is bringing Africa to you through all of our online platforms. 14 episodes from July 22nd to 28th take you to adventure through the Great Plains of Kenya's Masai Mara, the Serengeti in Tanzania, and the Greater Kruger Park in South Africa. Welcome aboard the wildest ride of a lifetime. This is Wild Wonderland live show, only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Zambia's newly appointed finance minister wants to introduce more austerity measures to rein in soaring debt and to stabilise the economy. The deputy head of the central bank, Bwalia Ngandu, has replaced former finance minister Margaret Mwana-Katwe. Ngandu says he might further delay a sales tax designed to rebalance the economy. Zambia's high debt levels and shrinking foreign exchange reserves have exposed the country's economic vulnerability. In 2018, external debt rose to $10 billion compared to $8.7 billion in the previous year. The Central Bank of Kenya has issued new rules to payment service providers, warning of ultimate liability in case of criminal breaches. In efforts to curb cybercrime, the CBK says commercial banks and technology companies should take responsibility for breaches through regular independent assessment and audit functions. Payment service providers, including MasterCard, Visa, Safaricom, Airtel and Telcom, have 90 days to comply with the requirements. Firms working with payment service providers are also expected to treat customer information confidentially. The two-day inaugural Afro-Asia FinTech conference has wrapped up in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Leaders in the financial industry called for innovative ways to include the 1 in 4 Africans who still don't have access to financial services. Wilkista Nyabwa has the details.
We are concluding with optimism.
The second day of the Afro-Asia FinTech conference saw thousands of delegates assemble yet again to discuss how technology could be used to support banking and financial systems in Africa. While almost 80% of Africans have access to financial services, experts are concerned about the 20% who still have no access to these services. Several studies have found that there are many barriers to overcome in order to reach the unbanked populations.
In fact, the estimate is that it takes at the minimum at least 2 to 3 months worth of income to get a simple smartphone. This is notwithstanding the fact that the cost of smartphones over the last 5 years has fallen by 50%, and the cost of making a call has fallen by 70%, is still inaccessible to as many as 1 in 4 that we are targeting to support.
Many more still struggle to access data, with Africa lagging behind in internet access. The two-day festival, co-hosted by the Central Bank of Kenya and the Monetary Authority of Singapore, provided a platform for an exchange of ideas between Africa and Asia as they explored sustainable innovations in financial services. The leaders explored fields such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, SME financing, and financial literacy. They also discussed how to create business environments and regulatory frameworks that would nurture innovations.
The way the rules have been written for incumbent businesses. And to expect the very same licensing, regulatory, reporting structures to then apply to a business that is designed to be disruptive, designed to be fundamentally different from what already exists, means that we also need to look, take a step back and not bind our own hands with the regulations that are in place.
Kenya remains a lucrative fintech market, with numerous commercial activities run through online portals and paid for on the innovative M-Pesa mobile payment platform. Bulkis Anyabwa, CGTN.
The information technology sector is one of South Africa's fastest growing industries. However, there's still a shortage of skills in this sector. Young people often can't afford to get into ICT learning institutions. With the government increasing its attention on youth employment, there's been more involvement from the private sector in helping prospective students. Sumitra Naidu has the story.
We Think Code is a non-profit tech institution. It's come up with an innovative way to train students with digital skills. There are no fees, no classrooms, and no teachers.
For the vast majority of our students, they have no prior experience. And all we really want to see is, over that course of time, do they start to show that they're learning in the way that we teach. So our pedagogy is a peer-to-peer learning system. So we don't have lecturers or teachers. The idea is we use code to solve problems. And when you go into a work environment and your boss says, solve this problem, he's not going to tell you how to do it. And so you need to learn how to learn.
All teaching is done online, so it can be done at any time from anywhere with a good internet connection, cutting out transport and other associated costs. We Think Code is partnering with the private sector to make the model viable and to absorb new talent.
Most of all the industries we now know are moving from the old ways to the tech front. Most of the data that we have can be digitized now. You have a machine doing a job that 20 people could do, and that's what we're moving towards as a country and as a planet, to be honest. And so more than worthwhile, it's actually essential to move towards the tech sphere, regardless of what industry you are in now.
You're starting to see South African companies that are reaching scale. If you look at companies like Get Smarter and Yoko, they're really starting to grow quite quickly. But we're also seeing a lot more corporates, and so entities that have existed since the early 1900s that are now saying, you know, we need to look at how we manage our own processes and how technology can impact our business.
Students are aged between 17 and 35. They have to undergo a 2-year course with practical application outcomes. Student admission also involves a series of logic tests to assess their aptitude for coding. Thereafter, there's a 3.5-week boot camp to assess their perseverance and willingness to learn.
My first year was 8 months, and I went to my internship for 4 months. It was amazing. They actually do projects that actually go into the real world, like production. It's pretty cool to have your work out there.
It's been cool. It's been a bit hectic as well. There's no textbooks that you learn as you go. So there's not going to be points in which you just study for a hard test and then you write it and you forget, because all the hard work that you put in wasn't you just sitting down reading something.
We Think Code is managing to bridge two vital gaps in South Africa: education and unemployment. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
Former German Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen has been elected as the new president of the European Commission. With a narrow win, she made history by becoming the first woman to be elected to the top job. Nearly 750 members of the European Parliament voted for her, winning with just 9 votes over the threshold. CGTN's Mariam Zaidi in Brussels describes how the vote played out.
374. The magic number needed to succeed Jean-Claude Juncker at the EU Commission. But could the former German Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen do it?
Vote in favour, 383.
A win by a whisker. Ahead of Tuesday evening's secret ballot at the European Parliament, as Ursula von der Leyen called for a stronger, gender-balanced and greener Europe, her prospects didn't appear too rosy.
I want Europe to become the first climate-neutral continent in the world by 2050. We must take bold steps together to reduce CO2 emissions by 2030 by 50, if not 55%.
For the Greens in the Parliament, the devil was in the lack of detail.
Goodwill and general intentions are not enough. We need a fierce determination to change course, even if it strikes the interests of those who defend the status quo. You will understand that in these conditions, the Greens are not ready today to entrust you with the rudder of the Union.
Also not supporting von der Leyen, far-right Eurosceptics, right-wing nationalists and far-left MEPs.
Plus de 800 milliards d'euros.
More than 800 billion euros is the check that the European Union makes every year to tax evaders. You are their candidate. We prefer to tear it up rather than vote for you.
But von der Leyen managed to cobble together a majority of Parliament's 3 largest parties: the European People's Party, the Liberal Renew Europe and Socialists. Von der Leyen has squeaked over the line by just 9 votes. Even her predecessor, Jean-Claude Juncker, managed to get 422 from a maximum of 729 votes. But no matter the fine margins, Ursula von der Leyen takes her place in history as the first woman at the helm of the European Commission. Mariam Zaidi, CGTN, Brussels.
The International Monetary Fund Executive Board has said that it will begin its selection process for the next managing director after Christine Lagarde announced her formal resignation on Tuesday. The resignation takes effect on September the 12th this year. Weeks ago, Lagarde was nominated for the presidency of the European Central Bank. She's set to replace Mario Draghi and be the first woman to lead the ECB. We are going to a short break now, lots more to come, including Johnny Clegg, South African musician and activist, dies aged 66.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Legendary South African singer Johnny Clegg has died. Clegg succumbed to a long battle with pancreatic cancer at his home in Johannesburg. He was 66. CGTN's Lonela Lupuwana has more. South Sudanese poet Bigoa Chewel explores issues of identity and war that many refugees grapple with. Her family fled to Australia in 1991, and Bigoa hopes that her poetry will start a conversation on the plight of refugees. CGTN's Astatal has more.
Bigoa Chewel walks through a wooden path in Australia, a poet looking for inspiration. 17 years ago, her family fled South Sudan as the country was in the thralls of war. Bigoa was a child during the journey and explores issues of identity and war in her poetry.
To the children whose birth water is broken by whizzing of shrapnel,
This is our portion. We know war in sunken eyes. We know it in the jabbing hunger pains. We know it in our heavily blistered, callous feet.
Through her poetry, she looks to start a conversation on the impact of war on refugees.
When you have the experience of being uprooted and not really having a sense of being safe and settled, you're not quick to really put your roots in the ground. So I've never really felt like I've left a place because I don't think I've ever really felt it was home.
According to the UNHCR, more than 4 million South Sudanese were forced to flee their homes. With her poetry, Bigwa hopes to highlight their challenges and triumphs. Astatal, CGTN.
All the sports coming up after the break, including Nigeria and Tunisia gearing up for the third place playoff of the Africa Cup of Nations.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
We begin with African football. Tunisia and Nigeria will square off in the third place playoff match at the ongoing Africa Cup of Nations in Egypt on Wednesday, after succumbing to defeats to both Algeria and Senegal in the semi-finals of the AFCON. The Super Eagles of Nigeria and the Carthage Eagles of Tunisia will be looking to end their campaign in Egypt on a high note. Nigeria will be laying in their 7th third-place layoff game when they face Tunisia, with the Super Eagles winning their previous 6 encounters. Super Eagles coach Gernot Rohr hopes his side can take the 3rd spot, especially after the Nigerian football authorities confirmed that he'll be keeping his job. Tunisia, on the other hand, have only won one of their previous 3 third playoffs, a victory over Uganda in 1962.
Sur le plan mental, et c'est là que c'est le plus compliqué,